So welcome everyone to the first live stream presentation of the 2020 Archives Bazaar. I am Susie Norshot and I'm a member of the LAist Subject Executive Committee as well as co-chair of the Archives Bazaar Planning Committee. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first three presenters, Romeo Guzmán and Carribean Fragoza of the South El Monte Art Posse. And Romeo Guzmán and Carribean Fragoza of the South El Monte Art Posse, and Diego Flores Magón of La Casa in Mexico City. They will be telling us about a fascinating, multifaceted public history project that involved building an archive and is ultimately a rewriting of the history of the Los Angeles County communities of El Monte and South El Monte. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining us today and sharing your work, which is a model of doing public history with marginalized communities. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions and comments, which you can submit using the Q&A function, the Q&A button. So over to our presenters.
Awesome. First, big thank you to everyone at USC, everyone at LAist Subject. Our main contact, Susan's been really great, Susie. And you guys can't see, but there's a whole team that has us doing all this cool stuff, and it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Anyways, it feels really cool. We can't be physically with you, but it's so nice to see all of you and to sort of be together. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the PowerPoint and we'll sort of get started. There's a bunch of stuff that we're gonna go over, so I'm gonna be really quickly give you a big broad overview, and then Diego and Carribean will give us a sort of slice of it to give you a good sense of what we're doing. So I'm here to talk about this project based out of El Monte and South El Monte called East of East Mapping Community Areas in El Monte and South El Monte. And this is a project that really started in 2012. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And the origins of the project are really simple. So I'll sort of give you when the project began, and then I'll give you a really big, broad overview, right? So the impetus for the project is really in 2012. And for the last 100 years, El Monte has celebrated this history of the white pioneers, right? As you can see from the logo, there's the end of the Santa Fe Trail, and there's this idea, right, that the history of El Monte begins with westward expansion, with the white arrival of these white pioneers. And at the centennial anniversary, this myth had remained intact, right? No one had really challenged it, despite the fact that we know, and we've been knowing, right, that El Monte is not the end of the Santa Fe Trail. And we've been knowing, right, that the white pioneers were not here first. The Tongva were the first people here, right? The Tongva are from El Monte, from South El Monte, from the LA region. So in many ways, part of the impetus was to tell a new history of El Monte. And we knew that in order to tell that history, we needed to build a new archive. We couldn't rely on the archive of our city museum, which again, as you can see here from one of the quotes from 1970, which might as well have been taken yesterday, their collection was strictly wagon wheel, right? So the big project for this was to really reorient, to tell a new history and to build a new archive. And one of the things that's unique about this project, right, and we can go to the next slide, is that it's really a collaboration between two different organizations that are very distinct. One is the South El Monte Arts Posse, which is an arts collective that Carribean and I direct, that we founded about 10 years ago, at almost the time when our daughter was born. And it's a very simple organization. It's a loose collective of artists that are interested in using art to reimagine space, right? So we're interested in sort of using art to say who gets to use the space, who gets to claim the space, and to really democratize art and make it equitable and make it accessible to everybody. Next slide, right? And it was also a collaboration at origins with Diego Flores Magón and La Casa. And Diego does not have an archive, does not have an art collective. He has an archive, and he was also trying to reimagine the archive. And he was specifically trying to reimagine what is an archive, how does it work, who gets to participate, and what's its role in society, both politically and culturally. So in many ways, there was just a lot of sort of methodological, epistemological connections. And the other really important thing, of course, is that there was a really important historical moment, which was 1918, when Ricardo Flores Magón, right, was in El Monte and wrote to his brother Enrique, and Ricardo gave a really famous speech. So, as some of you already know, right, the Flores Magón brothers were these two radical anarchists who were pushed out of Mexico, who launched a revolution from the US, and who were prominent throughout Southern California, throughout the US Southwest, and they happened to reside in El Monte for a time period. So we had a lot of different things, right? We had this idea to democratize, to push against the way history had been done. And we also had this very historical connection that pointed to a radical past. We knew that at least in this one moment, there was radical things happening in El Monte. And we also had a hunch there was more things and that this wasn't the end or the beginning of El Monte's history, but it was a nice departure. So let me just very quickly, next slide. And I'll just sort of flash this and we'll move on. But this is kind of the model of public history that we arrived to after 8 years of working on this, right? And we can really be summarized by thinking about our effort to really center community in the entire historical process. And what I mean by that is that the community is they're helping us build the archive. The community is central to what we find and we share it with them. And the community also drives how we share that knowledge, right? How we share that knowledge. And ultimately that means making it accessible and making it organic, right? Something that feels organic to the thing that we're writing about, and sort of minimizing that disconnect between representation and the subjects. Next slide. So we started with Diego in 2012. We actually lived together. For whatever different reason, my mom was moving and she happened to have 4 weeks that we could have the house. So Diego, our baby, Carribean, Ferdan, we all sort of ate and lived together, which I felt like a sort of very anarchist thing, right? To eat and work and do all that stuff together. And that was the impetus for the project. And after that, we kept working on it. And there's been a lot of different collaborators and organizations, and this is just a couple of them. So I do want to sort of nod to all those different people that have helped and have been part of this project. And one of the big, next slide, and one of the big sort of outcomes of this project has been a book, which is not the first book about El Monte, but we think it's the best one so far. It's a collection of 31 essays. It begins with the Tongva, it ends with 1990s punk, and it really is, we hope, exhaustive. And we also hope that it'll inspire other scholars, young scholars, to sort of write new histories, to flesh out new terrain, and to really help us continue to reimagine the history of El Monte, and to continue to burn the wagon, to continue to push against these old white pioneer narratives. So let's see, next slide. So I'll stop here, and I'll perhaps end by saying that, the goal was just to give you a broad overview. Diego will sort of situate his own work within Mexico City. He'll talk about what he did here with us in LA, and then we'll show one of the documents that we found together, and then Carribean will tell you a little bit about how we used it.
Hey, thank you very much, Romeo. Well, I would like to, you gave an amazing overview, no, of Southern Monte Arts Posse and its work in El Monte. And I would like to share an idea that I have that would reflect both on my work here in Mexico and on what we have done there in LA. And it is the idea, it's an idea and it's also a provocation to conceive the archive as a movement. And to explain what I mean by that, I will go back to another project that I did here in Mexico, or that I participated in, maybe that's more accurate, here in Mexico. And it relates to those images that you can see on that slide. I mean, they hardly tell the story, so I would make an effort just to tell it very simply and quickly. I was contacted by this guy who is on the left of the slide. That's my friend, Jose Antonio Sanchez, because he's the descendant of an anarchist in the state of Mexico, north of Mexico City. And he discovered correspondence between Ricardo Flores Magón, that Romeo has told you about, this the most famous, most influential anarchist in the story of Mexico. He discovered correspondence between his grandfather, whose name is Andrés Avelino Sanchez, and Ricardo Flores Magón, and he immediately knew that that was something that should be taken care of. He contacted me because he knew about my project in Mexico City, La Casa de Ahuizote, which is built around the the personal documents of one of the Flores Magón brothers, Enrique Flores Magón, who was also an anarchist, very active in both in Mexico and the US. And that was the beginning of a story that I think resonates a lot with what Romeo and Carrie have been doing California. And the best way that I can find to put it is my friend there, Jose Antonio, with his fellows in the state of Mexico, they started a movement, really. And what that means is, I mean, it has a lot of similarities with the case of the archives that help tell the story of Mexican communities in California, in that anarchism is a story that is buried, that is silenced, that is repressed. There are documentary traces of that story to be excavated, to be pieced together, but it doesn't, if it is to make a mark in the public consciousness, in the collective consciousness, then it cannot stop with this scholarly piecing together of traces, no, and maybe constructing a narrative for, you know, scholar circles. It has a stage that is completely addressing the public sphere through really public performance. And that is what I refer to when I say the archive as a movement. So what my friends in the state of Mexico did was, okay, this narrative is completely forgotten. It has emerged in a way that is completely fortuitous. Traces have been rediscovered of that narrative. And then what they did was to conceive of a program of public display and performance to really, what I call it is also to agitate around the archive, no? So one has to make a lot of noise. One has to make very visible performances central to community life in order to really achieve the goal of this community in particular, which is restating, reformulating official narratives, or contesting rather, no, official narratives. So of course, there in the state of Mexico, the official narrative has nothing to do with anarchism. And what they did, my friends, was perform plays written by these anarchists back in the 20s that were displayed back in the 20s as part of their political and cultural movement of resistance that had to do a lot with reclaiming land from haciendas in the state of Mexico. They renamed streets, they added plaques to historical sites relating to this narrative. And that's what I think, that's the aspect of the whole East of East project and South El Monte Arts Posse project that I would really love to stress here. And to provoke this idea that the archive really, you know, bring back to really help the return of the repressed, one has to have a program of agitation that passes through performance. And that, of course, implies a completely rethinking of the archive, how it is to be, what is its function, how it is to be used, for whom it is useful. This whole ideological program that really subverts certain universal, you know, common understandings about the archive and its uses, and put it to work for a program that really wants to revert unbalances in the weight of stories, you know, for the construction of official narratives. And well, regarding my role in the East of East project, I would put it in terms of, yes, there is this genealogy that has to do with radical movements, transnational radical movements, where my great-grandfather was involved. I have certain documents from the archaeological part of this narrative that I wanted to share. And that is also an aspect that I consider key, and maybe this is the closing thing for me. The sharing of documents, no? This policy, this attitude towards radical openness with the archive has political consequences. No, when I was approached by my friends, by my friend Jose Antonio Sanchez from the state of Mexico, I immediately gave him everything digitally that we had from his great grandfather in our archive, and that was key to really validate his struggle back where in his local, movement. And that was the same with Romeo and Carrie. Like the radical openness of archives really help embody and give energy to this kind of, upsetting, using the archive to upset, official narrative. And maybe I would leave it here for the moment and wait to see if there are questions later.
I think we can show the next couple slides. I'll do some framing and then we can show the video. These are more slides of what Diego was talking about. Go ahead and the next slide. And then one of the things that happened, and it took a lot of work, but we eventually got the City of El Monte to let us scan documents from their basement. Well, I should start over. They gave us permission to use their basement as an office space, because we didn't have any physical space. And while we were down there, as good journalists, as good historians, we started being metiches. We started sort of digging through things that we weren't supposed to. And eventually we said, hey, you know what, we should just scan these. And they said, sure, you can do that. So we started scanning all these photographs. Diego did a lot of the scanning. Jennifer and Tia did a lot of scanning. We had some volunteers come in and scan stuff. Go ahead and show the next slide. And we found a lot of things that really showed the perspective of the city and its approach to gangs, its approach to graffiti. So this is a graffiti inventory form. And one of the most revealing things that captured this sort of weird dynamic at City of El Monte is this video that we're about to show, which is a 60mm film. We didn't know how to digitize it. We didn't know where to see it. We finally got it digitized and we're really excited to show it. And I think it captures like what a city thinks about itself. And then the way we wrestled with like that official narrative, I think is something that Carribean will talk about. But I think at this point we could just go ahead and play the video.
East of downtown Los Angeles is the industrial community of South El Monte. More than 500 cities throughout the nation were nominated to receive the coveted 1974 All-America City Award. Only 12 were honored with it. And South El Monte is more than proud to be selected as the only city in California to receive it. The All-America Award is given each year to a select number of cities for progress achieved through intelligent citizen action. 17,000 people live in South El Monte, Over 33,000 work here. The city has a large youth gang population, few health and medical facilities, and a high student dropout rate. Large numbers of families are at or below the poverty level. How could a small industrial community merit such an award? South El Monte earned it by meeting daily challenges head-on. Of a gang gives youth identity. Chicano gangs are known as barrios. In a gang, the youths identify with their own ethnic customs, blended with modern-day realities. Many have been in youth detention facilities. Their world has limited opportunities. Gang members normally have poor school performances, poor attitudes, and usually are less useful members of society. In South El Monte, youth-oriented gangs represent a large factor in burglaries, vandalism, aggravated assaults. Graffiti identifies a gang's territory. A crossed-out gang name, a new name written in its place, indicates a challenge to territorial rights. South El Monte is trying to reach and somehow direct the vibrating energies of its local gang members through a gang outreach program. The basic idea is to provide its youth with real opportunities, such as employment, recreation, counseling, and tutoring, and to give the gang-oriented subculture direction and responsibility. As the gang outreach programs developed, both gang and non-gang members began to organize and plan their own activities. Hundreds of teenagers who previously turned their neighborhoods into battlegrounds now can have alternatives for their energies. A very real problem to the community is graffiti. Gang members involve themselves in a positive way. Walls previously marked were painted out. Murals designed by the gang members with the aid of artists hired by the city helped erase the eyesores and at the same time expanded the line of communication between the city and gang members. Hundreds of teenagers from different clubs throughout the city met on neutral territory for the Battle of the Bands. The city offered its new modern community center building, and the youth benefited from the financial proceeds of the event. all responsibility for organization and protection of city facilities, and gave a promise of cooperation among the gangs. Many meetings and strategy sessions were required. The gangs hired the bands of their own choosing, sold tickets and soft drinks, monitored and kept their word. The South El Monte Gang Outreach Program does not resolve the gang problem completely, but a new spirit of cooperation and trust is beginning to bud. Hundreds of gang members have begun to be involved in local programs and are finding them fun and worthwhile. Operation Gang Outreach creates an atmosphere. The program assumes that gangs and individuals do have the potential to work together for the good of all. Given the opportunity, youth can join hands and work toward promoting tolerance and understanding. Other cooperative happenings began to take shape. Gang members suggested and organized field trips to the beach, the mountains, and to major recreational facilities throughout the area. These trips gave the opportunity for recreation plus expanded rap sessions between gang members and workers from the city.
Can you guys still hear me? Sí. Okay. Well, I'll continue. So good morning, everybody. Buenos días a todos. My name is Carribean Fragoza. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the other director of the South El Monte Arts Posse. And I'm from South El Monte. It's a lot of fun every time I watch this video, so I really enjoyed watching it again. So Romeo talked a lot about what we do and how we do it, and this particular film was such a gem for us. We were not expecting to find it in the basement, but we did, and it was such a revelation to see all of it, but in particular the murals that were being painted, because they offered evidence that at some point in history, South El Monte, and eventually we found out El Monte, had murals. And I grew up in South El Monte without any evidence of art around me at all. So it was just such an amazing surprise to see that this had happened at some point before I was born. And like I said, there was no evidence of these murals anymore. They'd all been whitewashed. So this was an opportunity we found to excavate more about what had happened to these murals. And what we found was more evidence of these murals in interviews that we conducted with Ron Reeder. Maybe we can start the slideshow, and I can show you what we have. Okay. So there it is. So what was going on at the time, and you saw some of that with the video, was that there was a huge gang problem in the 70s, and Ron Reeder talked about this. But I learned more about this through the video and through some of the research that Nick Jarovic, one of our scholars and Posse members, did. There was this huge gang problem that had grown at the time. And without spending too much time into it, I just wanted to lay that out because there was severe unemployment at the time as well. And the city was really looking for solutions to keep crime at a low and to keep young people productive at the time. And so this mural program we came to learn again through Ron Reeder. If we go to the next slide, maybe we can see what I'm talking about. This is an article that we found about how angry, particularly the white community, but everybody as a whole was becoming about the graffiti that was really becoming a problem in South El Monte. And so again, this program for muralism came out of that. If we could move on to the next slide, please. This is Ron Reeder. So we had this moment where we discovered the film in the basement. And then through a separate occasion, we came to meet Ron Reeder, who's arts faculty at Rio Hondo College. And he was able to tell me about how he was actually the first muralism teacher, art teacher in South El Monte. And he told me about how he came into the program, how he was hired as a young artist to work with these young teenagers. And one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize before I continue is how important, just emphasize like the importance of these findings that came to us through separate avenues, and how we started to feel the necessity to put them together and start creating a narrative. So as we're finding pieces about the history and the past of South El Monte and El Monte, we start trying to find what is the narrative that can help us understand the place at the time, and then obviously why things are the way they are in the present. So Ron Reeder was just a critical part of that, because he gave us just really valuable interview time and gave us so much information about what was happening. So if we could move on to the next slide. And one of the things that Ron Reeder shared with me is that with his students, they were able to learn about the Siqueiros mural that had been painted in Placita Olvera. And at the time in the 70s, this mural had been whitewashed. It was not available to the public at all. As far as anybody was concerned, it was destroyed and lost forever. And all they had were images from books. And so he told me, Ron Reeder, that the students were really moved, really struck by the power of the Siqueiros murals, and those images really resonated with them. And they decided to make their own murals that were inspired by the Siqueiros image. And this mural here was made at the Valle Lindo Continuation High School. And again, we see some of, if you're familiar with the Siqueiros mural, if we move on to the next slide, we can actually see it. Can we move on to? So that's the mural. So you can see a lot of striking resemblances between the murals. And again, because it spoke so much to the young people that they decided to make their own interpretations of it. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So what this muralism program in South El Monte inspired was an additional muralism program in El Monte. So South El Monte and El Monte, for those of you who don't know, are like Siamese twins attached at the hip. We coexist, whether we like it or not. So El Monte decided with Ron Reeder to start their own muralism and arts programs funded by CETA. And that was sort of a remnant of the WPA arts program. And so they started painting their own murals over there. This particular mural of an Adelita, of a Mexican revolutionary, was painted by Roberto Gil de Monte and Gronk. And they were two of nearly a dozen artists that were hired by the City of El Monte using federal funds to make public art. And so again, this narrative starts to grow as I get more evidence from the film, from Ron Reeder, from my own research and asking around. And I learned about this art program that started to really take flight and grow into its own sort of entity. If we could move on to the next slide, please, that would be great. So this is a really interesting mural that sort of culminated in the program by Ron Reeder, where he was trying to imagine what kind of event could really bring a fractured community in El Monte together. And he thought, well, if Godzilla showed up and just caused chaos in our community, that's really going to bring all of the factors of our community together. And we can maybe forget about being racists for once and get along to fight Godzilla. And so what ended up happening is that the city council found out about this mural and decided to just slap a moratorium on murals from then on indefinitely. And so this mural was never actually painted, and no other murals were painted, at least not publicly, for decades after that, including in South El Monte. And again, this is why I grew up not seeing murals in my community, even though we know there were murals throughout the East Side, in Mexican-American communities, especially during the Chicano movement. Next slide, please. And here's an article that we found about the moratorium on murals. Next slide. And so what we decided to do for this particular film and story that we started developing, as we do for other stories that we have and for our archive, is we decided to create a public event. And this is where we invite community, and we did this, I believe this one was in 2016. We invited community to watch the film with us at the community center that was in the film. And we always invite people to share their stories. We conduct additional oral histories. I interviewed Ron Reeder for a public conversation with community. And this is all a way of continuing to build the archive, not just as a set of collected objects, but also as an ongoing conversation with community. So we really see it as a living process that continues beyond the archive. We just sort of expand what that means, especially as we write about our own community. And as a writer, this is what I do, and I'm fascinated by it. Next slide, please. And then even further, we took it to the next level and decided to make a new mural because, again, no murals had been made in decades. And what we did is, again, inspired by the striking imagery of the Siqueiros mural, we collaborated with our friends from Mexicali Rose, Marco Vera, Fernando Corona, and Alfonso Delgadillo, from Tijuana and Mexicali, to create this new mural. And this wall is actually on private property of our friend's home, and it faces an elementary school and a public park. So we really wanted it to be part of the community. And it's a family portrait using inspiration of these past murals and the landscape. So this was in 2016, the summer of 2016, that we painted this mural with the artists. And then the next mural, so this was additional imagery that was made for another public event. Again, using some of the same, the Adelita image that we see there with the Dodgers inspiration, and then the Siqueiros cross. And then the next slide, please. And most recently, I would say, actually, it seems like years ago, but it was just earlier this year that we were about to paint a new mural. Again, gathering all of these pieces of information and visual imagery. And we were going to paint this mural again with the same artists on the outside of Progress Brewery in their new location in the Valley Mall, where some of the original murals were painted and whitewashed. And so what ended up happening was this little thing called coronavirus pandemic. And it basically wiped out our plans, at least for now, to paint this mural. We hope to get back to it eventually. But again, this is just part of our ongoing living process of building the archive, but then also making it accessible, particularly through muralism and through writing these essays for the public. And I think this might be the last slide. So I don't know if I talked too much, but I think we can open it up to questions. I think I'm the last one to speak.
Yeah, I do not see any questions or comments that have come in, but if anybody has anything they would like to ask of Romeo, Carribean, and Diego, please go ahead and enter in your questions.
Romeo's coming back into the,
Okay.
he's reappearing. He's emerging from the mural.
And maybe while we're waiting, I'll ask a quick question. I mean, you found this wonderful film and you've collected other documents. Are any of these materials accessible, and how do you see them perhaps being accessible in the future?
That's a really great question. We're back home. So we were in Fresno for the last 4 years. I was at Fresno State, and we're now at TGU. And I think that really provides East of East as institutional home. So before that, it was just in my Dropbox. So now with the institutional home, we're really working with the TGU library to not just think about what kind of archive it's going to be, but like things, design, like. So the short answer is that partly because we're back at TGU, or because we're back home at TGU, there's going to be a digital archive, and we're hoping that there'll also be a physical archive to collect some of these physical objects.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Thank you. Does anybody have any other response to that? Or I can move on to, we have a question here. So exciting that you've uncovered some of the lost murals of El Monte. I'm co-author of the book Murales Rebeldes, LA Chicano Murals Under Siege. There are so many lost murals in LA. These murals are important evidence and documents of the vitality of the Chicano movement. Tracing them and documenting them is important to the history of Southern California, as well as to the history of art generally. Looking forward to seeing what murals you found. More of a comment of praise than a question. Somebody asked, how can we access these videos? I think you've already addressed that. Shout out to Professor Guzmán. My question is, do you know what happened to the gang intervention program? How did it end, or why did it end?
I'm trying to remember what happened to it. I suspect funds have a direct correlation with the ending of that program. As far as I know, it doesn't exist anymore. Because I know they were funded directly by either federal or state grants, but I'm pretty sure it's not active right now.
And I would just also say that even though the archive is not completely done, we have shared sources regularly with folks. So anyone who's interested in this particular aspect of a particular source, we're happy to send them a link to the Dropbox that they can access it. And then the other thing, we focus on the art a lot. But there's a whole narrative of, I think, gangs that's missing, right? Like a whole story of the gangs that needs to be uncovered, that these things give a glimmer to, and they also give a very sort of official narrative, right? So one of the things that Ron talks about is that some of these gang members didn't like each other, right? So they got in fights, right? So he talks about having to break up fights. So the film is funky because it's a sanitized version, I think, in a lot of different ways. And because you can tell that they didn't get everyone to participate in the film, in the making of the film, right? There's some big gaps there. So there's definitely a lot more to be done with that.
Okay, a few more questions have come in. What does the future hold for public art in El Monte? Will there ever be a home for a museum providing a more comprehensive view of our collective history?
There's two museums in El Monte. There's the El Monte Historical Society, which is colloquially referred to as the White Museum. That's a fact. And then there's La Historia Museum, which is one of our good friends and allies, and they've they're volunteer run, and they have a space dedicated to the barrios, right? So I think it's really long overdue for El Monte to think about what its museum should be doing, who should be running it, and what histories belong in it, right? And I think one of the things that we can sort of say, we're still working on it, but we're part of an exhibit in the LA Public Library next fall, and we're, to quote Diego, we're agitators, right? So the exhibit is going to propose to redesign the logo, but also to imagine what a museum would look like, right? And again, some of the things about us being at TGU is that we can collaborate with folks in museum studies and ask them, like, what does a financial plan look like for a museum? So we're actively imagining what that might look like, even if nothing comes to bear, right?
Looks like some good questions are coming through here. Thank you for this great presentation. How has the community response been, and does programming continue?
I think when people learn about this history, and when they learn that we had murals at some point, there's this great surprise, there's awe, there's excitement, and usually there's an immediate desire that they want more murals. I mean, that's almost every time that we talk about this, that somebody always gets excited about wanting to make new murals. So then we have to figure out what to do with that energy, how to harness it, and put it to use towards making something new.
Yeah, and I would say that we got invited to apply for a grant. We're finalists for that, and if we get that, we'll be developing bike tours based on the book. We'll be making a new mural, and we'll be working with educators to build curriculum. So the project never ends, and it's always grown organically. And we're also always excited for folks to tell us what to do, or to propose ideas, right? Like things that we can't come up with or things that we can't imagine. So we're always very open to new directions, right? To seeing where the archive takes us and where it leads us. So this is an invitation to anyone out there from El Monte, City of El Monte, that wants to become part of the Posse.
And maybe we have time for just a couple more questions here. About how many murals have you found, and how many do you suspect were painted?
I think that's hard to know. Talking to Ron Reeder, he directly remembers just a handful. To answer shortly, like, we don't have an exact number. So many have been lost, and we're hoping to gather more information just from family photographs or from memories that people can share with us. This is why these community events are so important, because this is where people bring their anecdotes and their memories and their photographs, and we can use that as like hard evidence to start counting. But currently, as far as I know, we don't have a hard number for that. So many have been lost with little evidence.
I would say at least 6.
In South El Monte.
And then Monte together, at least 6, but maybe more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have others in nearby San Gabriel Valley cities asked you about your model so that this kind of important research can be done for other communities like La Puente, Baldwin Park, Rosemead?
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else?
We hope they do. I'm from Pomona. My grandma and my grandfather bought a house in the South El Monte when it was possible to do so in the 60s and 70s. And my uncles and aunts were raised there. And so I spent the summers there, and obviously Caribbean's from there. So I have deep attachments there, but I'm from Pomona. So I very much hope that we can help, and that we can be part of reimagining the histories of the San Gabriel Valley and other neighborhoods and other communities.
Let's see, maybe I'll just ask you a couple more questions here. They are coming through, and I'm sorry, we might not be able to get to everyone, but has there been any cross dialogue with SPARC, S-P-A-R-C? Not sure how that might be relevant, but just asking, since a great partnership is in the making.
Yeah, SPARC is amazing. I'm a huge fan of SPARC, and I was a student of Judy Baca at UCLA many years ago during undergrad. So that's definitely, I don't know, foundational for me in terms of my awareness of murals and their importance through learning through SPARC and Judy Baca. I haven't had a chance to talk to Judy about it or through anybody at SPARC yet, but I know definitely that Judy Baca's earliest murals were funded by the CETA program, CETA. And that's, again, the same grant that funded our murals in El Monte and El Monte particularly. So that's definitely correct. An interesting and great collaboration, hopefully, in the future.
Okay, so I think we'll just end with one, I think, important question for you that might be relevant to several people who didn't get to have their questions answered. If we have additional questions, how can we connect with you by website or otherwise?
If you can go back to that very first page on the PowerPoint, program host, if you can go back to that very first page on the PowerPoint, we have our Twitter and Instagram names, and then we have our emails. Is it possible to go back to that first PowerPoint page?
We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook.
We're at SEMAP Arts Posse and at Gmail, or SEMAP Arts Posse at Twitter or Instagram. There it is. And you can message us that way and we'll get in touch. I would also sort of say that, La Casa has really been foundational for how we think about the archive and how we think about what it means to be archivists or historians. And they're constantly doing these really cool transnational projects. So I think for us, it's really important to also think about like how we imagine ourselves as transnational subjects and sort of tell stories that are relevant to both sides. So Diego's information is there too. So, please reach out to both of us or all of us.
Well, thank you so very much to all three of you for presenting on your really fascinating work and sharing this with us today. We're so appreciative and we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie.
Thank you.